NgRx Component Store is typically used to manage local state for just one component, unlike the more well-known NgRx Store, which is more geared towards managing global state. I've already done a video on Component Store specifically, so I'll link to that if you want to learn about how that works in detail. But in brief, it's kind of just like creating a standard service for your components to manage state, with a few nice features and additional architectural concepts built in. It's much closer to being a simple service than it is to something like NgRx Store with things like actions and reducers and so on. But a key difference with Component Store is that generally when your component is destroyed, the service and the state is destroyed along with it. It doesn't have to be this way though. We can take a slightly different approach to the way we provide the store to share state among multiple components in our application. So this can create a nice middle ground between just dealing with local state for one component and the full-blown NgRx Store approach. So let's take a look at an example where I've used this recently. As you can see, this feature component is making use of the client store. And by the way, for a detailed walkthrough of the overall architecture I'm using for this project, you can check out my Googler video in the description. So we're calling a load clients effect, and we are utilizing a selector from the store to get a stream of clients that we are displaying in the template. And if we look at the store itself, it is reasonably standard for a component store, except that we are using provided in. Whereas more typically with Component Store, we would not use provided in, we'd delete that part, and we would instead just provide this directly using the component's metadata. So when we take this approach, we are creating a single instance of the service just for this component. But if we don't do that and instead use provided in, we can provide it to multiple different components. Now, we could provide this in root to share this globally if we really wanted to, but this store is within the clients section of my app, and I wanted to make sure it is only shared among the client's features. So what I do instead is provide it in my client's shell module, and that's going to make this available to any of my client features here. So I'll be able to use this in the ad page, the dashboard page, the detail page. And all I need to do on any of these pages is just inject it, and it's going to share that same instance that is provided in the client shell. So if I open up the client ad page, for example, you can see I'm doing the same thing here. I'm just injecting the client store, and then I'm accessing the client selector again in here. And as well on my client detail page, if I open that up, you can again see that I'm injecting that store. So all of these pages are now sharing that same store, but one downside to this approach is that I need to make sure to call my load clients effect in the ng-on-init of each component that wants to use the store. So for this store in particular, I want to load some data, and that's what the load clients effect is doing. It's just going off to the client service, bringing in some data, and then setting it up in my state. So a typical way to approach this is, if you are just using this in a single component, is just to use your ng-on-init to call whatever effects you want to trigger when the component is initialized. But since we are using multiple different components and any of these might be our entry point, we might not always go through the client dashboard, for example, we need to make sure that effect is still called. So what I'm doing is just calling that in the on-init in each one of these components. And then in the store itself, I'm just piping on this first operator to make sure that this effect will only trigger once. So it's only actually going to go fetch the data once, even if we do call this effect multiple times. So this is the way I'm handling it for now, but interestingly, there is actually an RFC open for a new proposed feature that would add a init hook of some kind to the store itself. So in that case, we could then just trigger this load clients effect from within the store itself when it's initialized. So we wouldn't have to do this ng-on-init trick. And just a quick side note here, you can trigger this effect from the constructor if you want, and that will make sure the effect is triggered when this store is initialized. But generally we do want to avoid doing work in the constructor. It's going to make things harder to test. But if you don't care about that, that is technically an option. You could just call the effect in the constructor. So that's basically it. This approach provides the benefits of Component Store and allows for easy sharing of state between multiple components. So I kind of consider this to be a bit more architecturally sound than just a sort of standard service with a subject approach where you're kind of just, doing things however you want. But it's also a lot simpler than doing something like NgRx Store. So this is going to be suitable in a lot of situations, but of course it isn't a silver bullet, and it's important to keep in mind limitations where a different architecture might be better suited, like using the full NgRx Store, for example. Okay, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please feel free to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out, and I will see you in the next video.